Reviewing In Their Shoes by Jamie Windust. Now, I put it in another video, but I actually I can't talk. I actually picked this book up because I was at work, and my new workplace has a library that you can go into, and I was like browsing all the books, and I was like, "Ooh, this is good!" And I picked up another one called Gender Games as well. And this one had been on my list, and actually when I got home I realized I already have it on my shelf behind me. But anyway, and luckily I did, because that was a day that I ended up stuck horribly in traffic, and I had nothing to read, nothing to do, nothing to watch. My phone died, my tablet died, everything died. But I had this book, so I started reading it. And it's quite thin, so I got through it in about a week, but like most people that do these sort of videos would probably read it in a day. I don't. As you can see, I've tagged quite a few things. So Jamie Windust wrote this book, sort of, it's almost like a biography of sorts, but it's them talking about their life, coming out as a non-binary person, well, first gay, then non-binary, how their life has developed, and it's actually split into different sections. Like, one is about family, one is about allyship, one is about, I think, relationships, one is about, like, the way that they sort of discovered themselves. So it's like split into different sections. And it's obviously littered with their own personal anecdotes and all of that. Overall, I enjoyed reading this book. There were some parts where I was like, oh my god, like, I've been an ally of the trans community for a long time, but like there were some parts where I was like, yes, Jamie, this is the thing. This is the thing. Overall, I would say the book's quite raw, which probably Jamie would be like, yes, it is. And I believe they even say this is raw, because they're not a writer, they're not a professional writer, they've just sort of put their lives on paper. Sometimes I found it a little bit disjointed. It felt a little bit like we were traveling back and forth a lot. Sometimes I was like, wait, this kind of goes against something else I was said earlier. So it sometimes felt a little bit raw in that sense. But it had some pieces in it, and I've got some quotes to read to you, where it was just like perfect. Let me consult my notes that I made. They, for example, like in the beginning of it, they talk a lot about people. They do this thing where they like do these sections, and it's like 2 things or 4 things to do and 5 ways to be an ally, sort of thing. And I actually found it very interesting, because this book is obviously about them being non-binary and about their life, but some of the things that they said and the advice they give, I was like, I'm a cis woman, this totally applies to me too. You know, this applies to everybody. Like, this is 2 things to think about when exploring fashion. First, there are no rules. There are no times when you should or shouldn't wear something. That is all literally tied into patriarchy and misogyny to silence trans bodies. Don't listen to people who tell you that you should wear certain clothing for certain occasions. Job interview, wear the ball gown. Nipping to get some milk and emergency lemsip because you've started to get a runny nose, wear a suit. Do whatever makes you happy with fashion. Take your time, especially when it comes to being in public. But I thought the first rule, the whole there are no rules, this can totally apply to me as a cis woman as well. Because as a cis woman, we often feel like there are certain expectations for how we should dress and how we should be. Just like on people in general, men, women, you know, children. So I think it's quite nice to be like, actually no, there are no rules. Wear a ball gown to your job interview if that's what you want to do. So yeah, it's quite beautiful. It was also sometimes they write really beautifully about what it feels like to be trans and why they continue to pursuing being trans and non-binary, even though it obviously comes with so much trauma and so much stigma and stuff. So this is like a lovely little quote of them when they first bought like a lovely coat that they absolutely loved, and then wore to school and then had really negative reactions at school. How was it that my relationship to this coat had changed so dramatically in such a short space of time? This was the first time that I would experience this constricting feeling, the feeling of being elated and yet terrified all at the same time, of people pulling each thread of your joy, watching it unravel in their hands, a feeling that would follow me right up until this present day. A feeling that wasn't mine to feel, a feeling that shouldn't be mine to feel, and that was the most upsetting thing about it. That was my washing machine. That it was completely not my fault. But for me, that was a turning point in terms of fashion. I knew from that moment onwards that the way that I wanted to dress gave me so much more life and energy than the comments that it gathered. So that's just beautiful, and the way they speak about it is so beautiful. I think if they kept writing, they would probably develop their own voice and get better at it, and they would become maybe quite a compelling writer because they clearly have it in them. Just the way they talk about like the joy of being trans, and how the joy of it outweighs all the negativity that comes with it. It's just really, really beautiful. Let me see, what is the next thing? This is another thing where I was like, this isn't just about being trans. I felt the same way. So this is in the chapter where I talk a lot about their family and like being like the one quirky, weird member of their family and not really relating that much to their family, but still loving them. And a lot of the stuff they say, and I think queer people are so good about that. Like our community is just so good about, actually, we don't need to get everything from a romantic relationship. We don't need to place so much value on our family. You know what I mean? I think queer people in general are quite good in understanding that, much better than a lot of heterosexual cis people. But they write here, much like romantic relationships, I no longer place all of my happiness, strength, and sense of approval in how my family treats me. I get that from myself and my queer family, which feels like a healthier and easier balance. And I would agree. As a cis woman, I also had that feeling of like, oh my god, I'm constantly disappointing my family. My family is constantly disappointed with me. And then eventually realizing that I couldn't place so much value on my family, and that placing so much value on my family actually hurt me, and wouldn't ever change anything about the way my family engaged with me. So yeah. And they talk about the notion of blood being thicker than water, which is funny because that's not actually the quote. Let me find the actual quote. Right, so I found it. So the quote that people like to use is blood is thicker than water, and it's always placed upon like families, more important than your friendships. But the actual quote is, blood of the covenant is thicker than water of the womb. And what that means is that the relationships you choose are more important than the one of your family. So it's like the most misinterpreted and misused quote that I've ever seen, because the quote is literally exactly the opposite of what people claim it means. So yeah. So let's always remember that. You know, the family isn't everything. Find your joy in your romantic relationships, in your friendships. There's also the whole thing about like not everything, you shouldn't get everything from a romantic relationship. Like some people just want everything from their partner. Like they want to have the fun and they want their partner to be just like them so they can go out and blah blah blah. But you don't need to get everything from your partner. Some of it can come from friends and other things. So these are the things that Jamie advises to people about navigating family. And I think they're very valid just in general to navigating family. The first one is very particular about being non-binary. Although it might feel urgent, take your time when telling your family about who you are and your identity. Even if you have the most loving family in the world, sometimes it's better to ensure that you feel comfortable and sound enough in your own headspace and identity to share that with the world. Know that you don't have to answer all their questions. De-pedestal the notion that family are everything. This one is for everybody. This is a hard one because we're socialized and raised to see our families as the people that we have held closest to us. And know that relationships will grow, it will evolve, and things will change. And that's certainly true for me. So, yeah, it's just really, really beautiful. And they also talk about the fact that, unfortunately, for a lot of queer people, the way they first explore themselves and their identities, often through sex, because there is such stigma about being in a queer relationship, right? So they feel that all they can get is just the physical bit of it, and they can't get the emotional bit of it, which I have personally find extremely horrible and unfortunate. And this one is talking about relationships and how relationships shouldn't be everything. So the question here is, should that love and care always have to be supplied intravenously within romantic relationships? Are there other ways we can receive that love without having it to be packaged into romance from just one other person? So it's just really beautiful and really great. And they actually talk about their relationships, and they talk about dating somebody who wasn't monogamous. And they talk about quite a bit about how they explored that and how that was a bit difficult, and how they actually found themselves sometimes almost choked because they felt they were losing themselves in the relationship. But the interesting thing was that when they actually created like a little pro-con list, you can see here, they didn't actually add to the con list the thing that they had been talking about a lot in this chapter, which was the kind of the feeling of losing themselves in another person, and that other person kind of taking over themselves. They instead put things like, they look better in some of my clothes than I do, which is probably not as big as the whole losing yourself in another person and everything being about that person. So I thought that was just an interesting, because I wanted to know more about that. I wanted to know more about why they felt like that. I wanted to know more how they felt about being with somebody who was non-monogamous, because the chapter is literally titled, well, the chapter where they talk a lot about it is titled as poly. But they never really talk about what it was like to date somebody who wasn't monogamous, which I found a little bit sad. And then they talk about mental health a lot. That was the other thing they talked about a lot. And how sometimes it's really hard as a non-binary person to access mental health. Like they talk about the fact that, you know, they were like, oh, I'm gonna go to a spa because spas are nice for people who need mental health, not realizing that spas are incredibly gendered places. And that, like, this woman was there talking to them about like male facials and male skin, even though they were non-binary, and obviously they had to like be sorting themselves into male or female, and it was just not very pleasant. I just Da, 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 da. Yeah. I suppose the other thing they talk about a lot is, and I love that they talk about this so much, because they are very aware that they are white, they are thin, they are able-bodied, so they have a huge amount of privilege within the queer community, and are very aware that they are often picked as the queer person because they are more, I cannot say this word, palatable, but basically easier to digest for people. Like, people are more, it's easier for non-queer people to digest a white, thin, able-bodied person and maybe a black, disabled trans woman. And how they say, especially those with privilege within queer spaces, we need to make sure that we know when we're taking up space with our work and when it's important to pass the mic and amplify other voices. So they talk a lot about using your own privilege to amplify other voices and to understand your own privilege and to then use it to help others, which I really love, especially somebody who is quite privileged as a white cis woman. Yes, I'm oppressed because I'm a woman and I'm fat, but there are so many ways in which I am privileged, and I'm always very aware of that and wanting to elevate the voices of people who are not as fortunate as I am. So oh yes, this is they also talk a lot, obviously, about prejudice and dealing with people with prejudice and how to deal with that trauma. And they talk a lot about the fact that, like, a lot of society tells us to just move on and you know you're worth it. And they say all valid statements, but not necessarily compatible with the non-binary experience. The thing is, we know we are worth it. We know that we are valid. We don't have to be told these things as if we don't know our own power and strength. So I think a lot of times, like, and I've probably done the same thing, like, we might be trying to support people, but actually we are not helping them at all. We are kind of just telling them things that they already know. Let me just find the last few quotes. And they talk about, like, being a trans woman who is often asked, because they're quite prolific, to come onto programs and be there, and how they want to pass the baton. But then sometimes it's like, yeah, but what if I say no? And they then just have transphobes discussing trans people with no one to even offer a credible alternative, which is the whole other problem, isn't it? Because a lot of times if somebody says, actually, I think somebody else would be better served in this space, they don't know that's going to happen. It could be that the producers say, well, if they don't want to do it, then we'll just scratch somebody coming from that community. And I mean, we already know that the presentation and portrayal of trans people in the media is horribly biased towards transphobic content over trans elevating content. So it can be really hard to say no, and to talk a lot about the fact that you as a trans person are always needing to be the one to talk about your trans experience and regurgitate your trauma and talk about how horrible people are being to you. And why do I have to talk about other people being horrible? Like, you know, people are being horrible. It's just stop it. And they talked about a very horrific incident where they were sexually assaulted. And that they then called police, and the experience they had calling police. And I'll read it out to you. I rang them and they asked repeatedly what happened. What type of dress were you wearing, sir? How long was the skirt, sir? He probed, almost sounding like the very men whom I encountered a few years prior. Thank you, sir. Make a note of your case number and someone will ring you shortly about attending your house for a visit within the next 2 or 3 days. Thank you, sir. Goodbye. A tepid response when what I needed was warmth. And I can really empathize with this. I think it is so much worse for trans people, but I had an incident where I was in a park and some guy was there and he tried grabbing me, and I just reacted quite angrily. I was like, fuck off. And I pushed him away, and I was only in it was summer and I was on like a little mini skirt or flip-flops, so I would have probably knocked him, like I would have kicked him or something. But I just moved away, but then immediately called police. And to be fair, like, I was more angry than I was, like, upset. But even so, speaking to this police officer, he was so cold and detached. And there was no, I'm sorry that happened. There was no, are you feeling okay? Do you need anything? Here's the numbers of some services. Nothing. I ended up giving an interview to a journalist of a local newspaper about the incident, and that journalist the entire time was like, let me know if you need a break. He, despite not having had, I assume, the training that police dispatch people go through, he was like so much more empathetic, and the police officer I spoke to was absolutely unempathetic. Like, I get that they need to get the facts, but that doesn't mean that you can't say something as simple as, I'm sorry that happened, do you need anything else? Anything like that. It was so procedural and horrible. And when they wrote that sentence of like a tepid response when what I needed was warmth, that was that encounter for me. And I actually ended up complaining about them, and they wrote me back a lovely response going like, well, I was following the procedure, you know. And I was like, maybe you need to get better training so you're a little bit more empathetic to victims of sexual violence. Just saying. But obviously it went nowhere because that's police for you. So yeah, I really felt that experience for them, and I completely understood the experience they had, because it was very similar to the experience I had. The woman that came and followed up with me at my house, exactly the same thing, she was much better. But that man on the phone, he was horrible. So yeah, in the last chapter they talk a lot about empathy. So it's about allyship. And they talk about allyship starts with empathy and compassion. Empathy that takes you out of yourself and just for a second puts you into the shoes of someone else. It's something we are currently so lacking as a human race. Being in their shoes. Thus the title. Yeah. And let me just and then this is things they would say to people about being an ally, which I want to read out because you might want to be an ally, and this is want to do it better. Check your privilege. Just because you're part of a marginalized community doesn't mean you can't be an ally. Being queer doesn't mean you're not complicit within other institutional power structures, such as racism, Islamophobia, ableism, anti-Semitism, etc. Don't rely on the marginalized person to constantly be your educator. That's a big one. Educate yourself. Many non-binary people had to educate themselves through social media and online resources on the very notion and history of what being non-binary is. So the least you can do is to do the same. Decenter yourself from the conversation. This is a big one. For example, as white people, often our white fragility and lack of awareness when it comes to race can feel to some like an attack on you as a person. But knowing that this isn't about your feelings as a white person, and is more about knowing how we are complicit with an institutional racism, and more so how we can start a continual journey to ensuring that we stamp out and erase these practices in our day-to-day, is the most important thing that we need to be doing. So yeah, I absolutely loved this book for those moments where it was like, "Oh, yes, right, Jamie, go Jamie." It was very raw, like I said. I would probably give it a 3.5. But it was a great read. I would certainly recommend it to other people. And I will finish with a quote for non-binary people, which is one thing that Jamie would say to non-binary people about prejudice. It's never our fault. Ever. And then the final bit of the book, which is, no one can replace you in this life, and being non-binary is never something that you have to change about yourself, ever. It's something that will feel like a weight on your chest as well as a crown on your head. Wear it with pride, let it shine, and allow it to glisten atop you. I am so proud of you. We are so proud of you. Forever. Forever we will continue to rise, like we have been doing since the dawn of time, as a force that is never ending. Never forget that power that you have, for it's yours. Cherish it and hold on to it, and remember to breathe.